The broadcast remains one of the defining moments of the Queen's 65-year reign. Dressed in black at Buckingham Palace the evening before Princess Diana's funeral, she addressed the nation, declaring, "No one who ever knew Diana will ever forget her." She was speaking, she said, both as a monarch and a grandmother. "Diana was an exceptional and gifted human being," said the Queen. "In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys. This week at Balmoral, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered." That last sentence was seen as an answer to critics who argued that the royals had badly misread the public mood by staying hidden on their Scottish estate while the focus of the nation's grief was in London at Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace, where tens of thousands of people laid floral tributes. New Labour government officials, who it's said persuaded the Queen to make the broadcast, had vetted her script. But what were the private thoughts of Her Majesty that week, the most dramatic and poignant days of her reign? Now, a letter from the Queen to one of her most trusted confidants, Lady Henriette Abel-Smith, a lady-in-waiting, has just been unearthed. It was written 6 days after Diana's funeral and, for the first time, sheds a fascinating light on what she calls the royal family's emotions. The Queen, Prince Charles, and William and Harry stayed at Balmoral, where they had been the previous week when the news of Diana's death was broken to them. The content of the letter, in reply to one of condolence from Lady Abel-Smith, is mostly typed. "Thank you so much for your letter about Diana's tragic death," it reads. "It was indeed dreadfully sad, and she is a huge loss to the country. But the public reaction to her death, and the service in the Abbey, seem to have united people round the world in a rather inspiring way. William and Harry have been so brave and I am very proud of them." Fascinatingly, the Queen adds a personal postscript in her own handwriting: "I think your letter was one of the first I opened. Emotions are still so mixed up, but we have all been through a very bad experience." Private letters from the Queen very rarely surface in public. Lady Abel-Smith was a lady-in-waiting from 1949 until 1987, and her letter, a copy of which was passed to the mail, is now in private hands, having been auctioned after her death, aged 90, in 2005. Royal commentators believe it reflects both the royals' horror over Diana's death and the effect on William and Harry, and the Queen's bewilderment at the public turmoil over the royal family's seemingly distant response. Dr. David Starkey, the eminent historian who has written many books on the monarchy, insists the remarks must be viewed in context. "It is important to remember that, like most of her generation, the Queen is emotionally very reserved," he says. He explains that, at the time, she was accused wrongly, in his view, of not showing enough compassion. Very soon after Diana's death, the Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, and William and Harry went to church as usual on the Balmoral estate. The vicar was instructed not to mention Diana in the service, prompting the charge that it was probably the only church in the country that did not mention the princess by name in its prayers. It was as if she was being airbrushed from history. There is even a suggestion that 12-year-old Prince Harry said to Charles during the service, "Are you sure Mummy is dead?" The sheer intensity of the public response to Diana's death, at the age of 36, took Buckingham Palace aback. As did anger among MPs and the public, who felt the royals were aloof and uncaring. The hostility was inflamed by the fact that Buckingham Palace's flagpole had stood bare, in stark contrast to the way flags on all other official buildings had been lowered, and to the mass of flowers at the palace gates. It did not matter that the Queen was simply observing protocol, that the royal standard is flown above the palace only when she is in residence, and had never been at half-mast because it symbolizes the continuity of the monarchy. When, finally, the Queen came to London and made her TV broadcast, the standard was flown at half-mast. And the crowds broke into spontaneous applause. She tore up the rule book to support the nation in its grief. That public backlash had shaken her, says royal commentator Michael Thornton. By talking of a very bad experience, the Queen meant not just the shock of the death of Diana but the events of the week after, which were unprecedented to someone who had such a well-ordered life, he says. I suspect she still struggles to comprehend what happened that week. Penny Junor, whose semi-authorized biography of Camilla Parker Bowles is top of the bestsellers list, suggests the Queen was trying to be a good grandmother while being unfairly criticized for doing so. She was thinking of William and Harry, she says. For the first time in her life, she put family first by staying in Balmoral with the boys. The fact those boys were as brave as they were, and able to do that ghastly walk behind the coffin, is, I suspect, a lot to do with the support they had during that week from their grandparents. If their grandmother had left them to go to London, it would have been terrible for them. Ian Shapiro, a leading London collector of royal memorabilia, said it was almost unheard of to read a letter from the Queen in which she expresses such private views. I think the comments reflect the Queen's utter confusion, he said. She was following her instinct by staying with her grandsons. At the same time, she was being bullied by the government over the need for a broadcast to the nation, to leave Balmoral and to lower the flag over the palace. A very bad experience sums up all of that. He added, the use of the exclamation mark at the end of letter is significant. I've seen many letters written by the Queen and she rarely, if ever, uses it. When it's used properly, the exclamation mark represents a high level of emotion, and that's clearly what the Queen was feeling. One previous hint of the Queen's view of Diana's death and the public reaction to it came from Margaret Rhodes, who was the Queen's first cousin and one of her longest-standing friends. She died, aged 91, last November. In an interview on US television, she said the Queen remained at Balmoral because she put her duties as a grandmother before those as a monarch. She was castigated for staying up at Balmoral with the two little boys, she said. She was being a proper granny. What was the point of bringing the boys down to London with nothing to do but sit there feeling sad about Mum? I think I would have behaved in exactly the same way. In her broadcast on the eve of the funeral, the Queen said, I, for one, believe that there are lessons to be drawn from Diana's life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. Those words seemed to be an acknowledgement that, in some important respects, the Queen, her family, and her advisers had misjudged matters in that tumultuous week after Diana died. The private letter from the Queen to one of her favourite ladies-in-waiting seems to confirm that view.